Good evening and welcome to our weekly Bible study. We are going to be in, let's see, where are we going to be tonight? Chapter 37. We're going to end chapter 37, talk about chapter 38, and then chapter 39. So let's just pray and get started. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this lesson. Thank you for teaching us, Lord, that you have purpose in our lives. Even when things seem to be gone awry, you have purpose in our lives. And Lord, help us to just be faithful, to just trust you, and know that you're the one that's in the driver's seat of our life. Father, help us to be faithful servants. Help us to remember Joseph's story when our life seems like it's just spinning out of control, and to remember that his God was faithful and that we serve that same God. So, Father, forgive us. Use us for your glory. Use us for your honor. And forgive us, Father, where we falter, where we fail, where we doubt in our lives. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we are going to, like I said, we're going to mostly do chapter 38 and then 39. We left off in chapter 37 last week. I think with, I forgot what verse we left off with, but we left Joseph, his brothers had just sold him to the caravan coming by. He was taken to Egypt and sold as a slave. They killed a goat, put blood on that ornate coat that Jacob, Joseph's father, had made for him, and they take it back to Joseph. They ask him to Jacob and ask him if he recognizes it, and he, of course, assumes that Joseph has been killed by wild animals, and they let him assume that, and he mourns and mourns and mourns for his son. He says that he was just inconsolable, and he said, "I will mourn until I meet him in the grave." And so chapter 38 and 39 remind me of a bad R-rated movie. You know, we will realize from chapter 38 and 39, we've already had things like Lot sleeping with his daughters, and chapter 38 and 39 remind us that our culture and our generation certainly does not have a corner on the market of ungodly living, especially sexually ungodly living, even though we've taken it to another level by all means in our cultures, in our modern day cultures. But just hang on and listen to this story. This is chapter 38. Chapter 38 deals with Judah. He was, I want to say maybe the third oldest, fourth oldest. I don't know what birth order he was of Jacob's 12 sons. But Judah is the one that Jesus will come through this line. He will come through the tribe, through the line of Judah. And yet, listen to this story. Judah moves away from his brothers. He marries a Canaanite woman. He has 3 sons. His sons are Onan, and Shelah. So he goes out, he finds a wife for his oldest son. He brings her back. They are married. It says that was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord killed him. The Lord put him to death. So Judah did what was customary in their culture. He tells Onan, his next to the oldest son, you must marry his wife. The wife's name was Tamar. Many of you will know this story. He says, you must marry Tamar. You must give her children. Well, Onan knew that these children would be credited to his brother and not to him. And so he managed to not get her pregnant. He purposefully would not get her pregnant. Even though it was his obligation, even though it was their custom, he purposely would not do that because he did not want those children credited to his brother. He wanted children, his offspring, credited to him. So she did not get pregnant. And it says, the scripture says, this was wicked in the sight of the Lord. And so the Lord put him to death. So Judah, the father-in-law of Tamar, decides, I really don't want her having my 3rd son. I only have 1 son left. I don't want her having my 3rd son. And so he tells his daughter-in-law, Tamar, you go home to your father's house. Live in your father's house as a widow. And when my youngest son gets old enough, I'll send for you then. Evidently, he was younger. He says, I'll send for you then. But go live in your father's house as a widow until then. So time passes. Judah's wife dies. He mourns his wife. It's time to get on with life. And so he decides that he's going to go to Timnah, where his workers are shearing his sheep. Someone tells Tamar, his daughter-in-law, that Judah is headed to Timnah. So Tamar takes off her widow's clothes, puts on a veil, disguises herself, and she goes and sits by the road on the way to Timnah. Judah comes by. He assumes that she's a prostitute, and so he propositions her. And she says, well, what will you give me? And he says, I'll give you a young goat. And she says, okay, but I need a pledge from you until you deliver the young goat. And he says, that's fine. What do you want? And she said, well, I'll take your staff and I'll take your seal that has the cords attached to it. So he gives her his staff and gives her the seal with the cords attached to it. He takes her, he lays with her, and that's seemingly, he thinks, the end of the story. He gets back, he sends a young goat with someone to find Tamar, and Tamar is nowhere to be found along the road to Timnah. And so he says, no, don't search for her. It'll make me a laughing stock for this prostitute that I owe to just disappear with my stuff. And so he says, don't search for it. It's no big deal. Just don't search for her. So she goes back home. She puts back on her widow's clothing, but she does get pregnant. So 3 months later, Judah hears that Tamar is pregnant because of prostitution. Well, he is enraged. He is enraged. And so he says, bring her out and burn her to death. So as they're bringing her out, she sends a message to Judah. And she says, I'm pregnant by the one who owns these things. And there is the staff and the seal with the cords attached. Do you recognize them, Judah? I'm pregnant by the one that owns these things. Do you recognize them? And Judah's response was, she is more righteous than I am, because I would not give her my son. He never had any more relationship with her. And that is the end of the story as far as we know, except that she did have twin sons. Kind of interesting, just a little tidbit. One of them sticks their hand out first, and so the midwife ties a scarlet cord on it. Then he draws his hand back, and the other child is born first. But it's like bad R-rated movie. It just, and it doesn't get better. The next chapter has more stuff in it that just goes on from there. At least that is what is entailed in chapter 38. Chapter 39 gets back to Joseph. Joseph has been sold in Egypt by the caravan. He was sold to Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh, a very influential and powerful man in Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph. We hear that many times throughout these chapters about Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph, and so he prospered. As a result, Joseph lived in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar elevated him in position. He became Potiphar's attendant. And because of Joseph, and because Joseph's God was kind to him and he prospered, so did Potiphar prosper as a result of Joseph. And so he put Joseph in charge of everything that he owned. The only thing that was withheld from him was his wife. And so Joseph took care of Potiphar's things, and Potiphar was blessed as a result of Joseph's relationship with God. So that is where our lesson actually begins today. So we are going to start in chapter 39, verses 7 through 10. After a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." He refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. But no one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against my God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. So Potiphar's wife liked what she saw in Joseph. He was probably young and handsome and well-built and all of those things that would have made him very attractive to her. And she wanted him. It was just that simple. She wanted him. Even though she was the wife of one of the most powerful men in Egypt, here we go again with the immorality, the sexual immorality. And so he refused. She propositions him. He refuses day after day after day, it says. And Joseph knew that he had a good life. He knew that his master trusted him. He knew that if he did this horrible thing, that he could be put to death. All Potiphar had to do was say, you're done. I'm putting you to death. And we would have been killed. He knew that his master trusted him. And he said, how can I do to his wife? He says, how can I do such a wicked thing against my master and against my God? Joseph knew that he had a life that most slaves in Egypt didn't have at that time. And so he avoided her. It says that he would not even be with her, be around her. So he avoided her as best he could. And then in verses 11 through 16, one day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by the cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak with her, in her hand, and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. She kept the cloak beside her until his master came home. Potiphar's wife wasn't happy with Joseph under any circumstances. Day after day after day after day, he refused her advances. So she basically planned to set a trap for Joseph. It's kind of that, I'll fix you, buddy. You don't do what I want you to, I'll fix you. So Joseph goes into the house to do his normal duties. And she had purposefully dismissed all of her household servants. None of her servants were in the house. So now, even though Joseph had tried to avoid her, I'm sure he tried to only be in there when there were other servants around. Now he finds himself alone with Potiphar's wife. So she demands that he go to bed with her. He refuses. She grabs him and grabs his cloak. And so he runs away. He gets away. He runs away. But she still has his cloak. I'm sure she was embarrassed. I'm sure she was humiliated. Why wouldn't this Hebrew slave? And she thought he was so much below her. I mean, he was a Hebrew slave after all. Why didn't he obey her? Why didn't he do what she told him to? Embarrassed, humiliated. So she screams and she calls her household servants back in there so that she can pursue her lie, so she can tell them her lie. Look, she says, that Hebrew slave tried to make sport of me. We have another place where that terminology is used here in Genesis, make sport of me. You know, he tried to take advantage of me. He tried to make sport of me. But I screamed and he ran away, but he left his cloak. And yes, he did run. He was fleeing from temptation, trying to flee from sin like we had just a few chapters ago. So she kept his cloak so that she could tell her husband the lie. And so we go to chapter 39, verses 17 through 21. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Potiphar's wife wanted revenge. She had been humiliated. Even on demand and grabbing Joseph, he still managed to get away and refuse her advances. So she wants revenge. She tells her household servants how it went. She keeps the cloak, and now she tells her husband this lie. How Joseph had tried to force her, and how she screamed, and how he ran, and that's why she had his cloak. And then listen to how she states this. This is how your slave treated me. Doesn't that sound familiar? Making it Potiphar's fault that Joseph had supposedly attacked her. Remember in the Garden of Eden, Adam's words, "That woman you gave me, God, is the one that made me do it." Always blaming someone else, always passing the buck, always trying to put the guilt on someone else instead of taking ownership of her own guilt. It was circumstantial evidence. It wasn't the whole truth. It was a half-truth. He did leave his cloak. He did run. She did scream, but it was another one of those half-truths, kind of like the half-truth of Abraham, where he kept telling the rulers that Sarah was his wife. A half-truth isn't truth. So imagine how Potiphar feels. This young Hebrew slave that he had taken in, that had prospered while he was in his household and had been the reason that Potiphar had prospered. This young slave that he had grown to trust and admire, that he had put in charge of his entire household, except for his wife. He had elevated him in position and totally placed his trust in him. And now this, and now this. The Hebrew word that was used for burned with anger indicates the flaring of the nostrils. You've known people that when they got mad, I have a daughter-in-law like that. Their nostrils flare. This was that description of his anger, a fire that's just been stoked, and he was so angry that his nostrils flared. This slave that I have given this opportunity, that I have elevated, that I have trusted, has betrayed me. So in verse 20, it tells us that he throws Joseph in prison. Not just any prison. He throws Joseph in the king's prison. Only a man of high authority, high level of power could have even done that. And so he throws Joseph into the king's prison. Now, this is not your normal prison. This is a prison reserved for people who have offended the king in some way or done the king wrong in some way. It was not a good place to be. Not a good place to be. Joseph goes on to describe it as a dungeon. You know, Joseph had been in a bad place before, and he's in a bad place again. Remember, his brothers put him down in an empty cistern? Had his brothers left him there, of course, Reuben was planning to go back and rescue him, but had his brothers left him there, he would have died of thirst. He would have just died in that cistern of thirst. Not a way I would want to die. So here he finds himself again, basically, in the bottom of that cistern. He calls it a dungeon in this prison. But God wasn't through with Joseph. God was not through with Joseph. Potiphar had turned his back on Joseph, but God had not. And so we see in verse 21 that the Lord was with him. The Lord showed kindness to him, and he received favor from the warden. Just like he had received favor from Potiphar, he receives favor from the warden. Verses 22 and 23 were not in our reading, but I think they're very important. It says that the jailer actually put him in charge of all those that were held in the prison. I'm quite sure if I was in the king's prison that I would have rather been under Joseph's charge than under that warden's charge. So I think it was a good thing for the prisoners. It went on to say in verses 22 and 23 that the warden paid no attention to anything that was under Joseph's control. He didn't worry about anything. If Joseph was in charge of it, which he was in charge of all of those that were held in the prison, if Joseph was in charge of it, the jailer just didn't even worry about it. The warden wasn't concerned about it because he trusted Joseph that much. And Joseph had that good of leadership skills. Potiphar had seen them. The jailer sees them. Both of them had elevated him to the highest possible position that they could elevate him to because they recognized God in his life and that God prospered him. And as a result, if they were good to Joseph, God prospered them also. So let's kind of see what we can do to bring this lesson to an end. You know, we can be doing God's will and face hard times. We can even face calamity. But what is calamity in this life? This isn't our end goal, and we have trouble thinking with that mindset. But we can be doing God's will and really face hard times. We can even face calamity. Just ask Job. Just ask Joseph. But we see that the two positions that Joseph had under Potiphar and under this prison warden were just preparing him for what he'll be doing in next week's lesson. They were preparing him for one of the biggest leadership roles recorded in the Bible. Short of Moses leading the people out of Egypt, this could be one of the biggest roles that God puts someone in. One of the biggest that God puts someone in the entire Bible. And I'm going to quote a verse that I know will be quoted later on and that we'll study later on. It's chapter 50, verse 12, but I think it's just so important in these next two chapters. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. This life may try to harm us. People in this life may try to harm us, but God will work it out for our good. I love the verse that says that we just don't have to worry about things because all things work for the good of those who trust the Lord and love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Joseph, even though he was in a foreign land, serving as a slave under other leaders in that land, God had a purpose for him, and he was dedicated to that purpose. So even though they meant harm by throwing him in prison, his brothers meant harm by selling him to the caravan to be sold as a slave, God intended it for good, and he used it for good. So sometimes the things that seem to be the very worst turn of events in our lives, the very worst possible turn of events in our lives, maybe God just preparing us for what his purpose is. So we need to stay close to God. We need to give thanks in all things. And I tell you, I have learned the hard way. I have learned the hard way that things don't seem to get better until we give God thanks for whatever misery and hardship is in our life. You know, I felt that way when I had cancer, and I was so scared, and I was just not understanding. And I finally got to the point where I could say, God, thank you. I don't know what the purpose of this is. I don't know where this is going to take me, but I do know you're going to make that journey with me. The same thing with my husband. I didn't understand it. He had not been a Christian for very long. Our life was just getting to be where it was supposed to be. We were retired, and then he got really ill. And I didn't understand it. But I had to get to the point where I could say, God, I'm going to thank you for it, even though I don't understand it, even though it seems so totally wrong to me. I got to thank you for it. And when we can get to that point, it feels to me in the times that I've done it, that that's the turning point. It's like God does not give us peace until we can get to that point. So all things work for the good of those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Joseph was called according to his purpose, and he loved the Lord, and he stayed faithful to the Lord. You know, we never, ever see Joseph angry. He could have been so angry with his brothers that he held this grudge, and it could have just destroyed his life. Instead, he just picked up in Egypt. We never see him angry. We never see him resentful. We just see him serving God. And as a result, God was with him every step of this journey, even through what were those seemingly really bad situations. So the lesson we learn from Joseph, regardless of life circumstances, we just need to remain faithful to God. Keep a humble, patient, positive attitude, even through the worst of times. Keep trusting God, because God is faithful.